Hello and welcome. You know, the right to strike is probably a worker's most powerful tool. But in a country like India, when does that right start to clash with the need for, say, economic stability? It's this huge question that puts fundamental freedoms right up against national progress. And let me tell you, the answer is not simple at all. So let's break it down.
Okay, let's just get right to it with a really direct question. Could you actually be put in jail for going on strike in India? Well, the short answer is, it's complicated. To really understand why, we have to unpack decades of law, some major court rulings, and a few very recent and very significant legal changes.
At its heart, this entire debate is really about a fundamental conflict. You've got a worker's ultimate tool for collective bargaining on one side, and on the other, you have the state's need to keep the economy stable and maintain public order. So, where exactly does India draw that line? To find that line, the very first place we have to look is the supreme law of the land, the Constitution of India. And this entire legal debate really begins with what the Constitution says, and maybe even more importantly, what it doesn't say. Here it is, Article 19(1)(c). This is the legal cornerstone of this whole discussion. It says very clearly that every citizen has the fundamental right to form associations or unions. That part is crystal clear. But here's the question. Does the right to form a union automatically mean you have the right to use its most powerful weapon, a strike? And this is the absolute key distinction. The Constitution guarantees the right to form a union, but the right to actually strike, it's just not in the text. It's nowhere. This silence in the Constitution is the source of the entire legal battle that's been going on for years. So, because the Constitution was silent, it fell to the Supreme Court to interpret what that silence meant. They had to answer that critical question. If you have the right to form a union, does that automatically give you the right to strike? And for more than 60 years, the Supreme Court has been asked to fill in that constitutional blank. They've done it through a whole series of landmark judgments that have really shaped India's labor laws, and honestly, their position has been remarkably consistent the entire time. Let's look at two of the most important moments here. Way back in 1962, the court flat out ruled that the right to strike is not a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution. Then, fast forward to 2003, in a case called T.K. Rangarajan, the court went even further. They said that government employees have absolutely no fundamental, no legal, and not even a moral right to strike. So this is the crucial legal difference the courts drew. The right to strike isn't a fundamental right, it's a statutory right. What does that even mean? Well, think of it like this. A fundamental right is something you're born with. It's inherent. A statutory right is more like a privilege that's granted by a specific law, a statute. And the key thing is, what the law gives, the law can also regulate, restrict, or even take away. And that little detail brings us right up to the present day, because a new law has done exactly that. It has fundamentally changed the regulations around this statutory right. Right. So in 2020, India passed something called the Industrial Relations Code. The main goal was to take dozens of old, kind of complicated labor laws and merge them into one single streamlined code. But in doing that, it brought in some pretty significant new rules for anyone wanting to strike. And this really shows you just how tricky it is now to hold a strike that's actually legal. First, all workers have to give 14 days notice. Second, and this is a huge deal, strikes are totally banned while any conciliation talks are happening. That's basically formal negotiations overseen by someone else. And that could put a strike on hold pretty much indefinitely. And third, if you don't follow these rules to the letter, the penalties are now way, way more severe. So if a worker joins a strike that's deemed illegal under this new code, they could be looking at a fine of up to 50,000 rupees. And it's not just a fine. They could also face up to 1 year in prison. So to go back to our very first question, yes, under the new law, you can absolutely be jailed for going on strike in India. Now those are some incredibly strict rules with really severe consequences, which leads to the obvious question, why, right? Why would you create a system that makes legal strikes so hard to organize? Well, it all comes back to that really difficult balancing act between competing national interests. So, what is the government trying to do with these tough new restrictions? And on the flip side, what are the big concerns from critics and labor advocates? Let's lay out both sides of the argument. Okay, so the government's stated goals are things like promoting industrial peace, improving the ease of doing business to attract investors, and making sure the economy is stable. But critics and unions, they argue these rules just gut a union's bargaining power. They say the restrictions might be so tough that they fail the constitutional test of being reasonable. And there's also a concern they could even violate India's commitments to international labor standards. So, where does all this leave the future of labor rights in India? The legal ground has clearly shifted. The balance seems to be tilting away from the freedom to strike and more towards state regulation and, industrial harmony. Let's just quickly recap the key takeaways here. First thing to remember, the right to strike is not a fundamental right in India's constitution. Second, it's a statutory right, which means it's a privilege granted by law and can be controlled by law. Third, that new 2020 code has put in place really strict procedures that make organizing a legal strike incredibly challenging. And finally, this whole situation just highlights that deep, ongoing tension between a country's economic goals and the rights of its workers. The real challenge, as a lot of legal experts point out, is finding a path forward that doesn't just sacrifice one for the other. A path where you can have industrial peace, but not at the cost of essential labor rights, and where both of those things are in line with the nation's core constitutional values.
And that leaves us with the final and, I think, most crucial question, one that goes way beyond just India. In today's global economy, how does any nation strike that incredibly delicate balance between pushing for economic growth while also protecting the fundamental ability of its workers to stand up for their rights? That is the challenge that lies ahead.